The refrigerant tracking tools in SuccessWare 21 allow you to identify the type of refrigerant used and the capacity in pounds and ounces for equipment at a service location. You're able to record the addition to and recovery of refrigerant from those pieces of equipment. You're able to track the usage and recovery transactions against individual cylinders, track and report the leak rate of refrigerant, and schedule required follow-ups for units when required, and report on all usage and recovery of refrigerant by customer, technician, and type of refrigerant. There is some setup involved. First, some reference book setup. There's a reference table called Refrigerant Types. This contains a list of types of refrigerant that you use and recover. This list comes pre-installed but can be edited if necessary. There's also an addition to the equipment type table. It now contains a column that identifies whether that specific type of equipment contains refrigerant. Customers with equipment that has now been marked as using refrigerant will have to have that equipment updated to contain the type of refrigerant used, as well as the capacity and total charge of refrigerant in that equipment. You're also going to need to create usage and recovery cylinders in the Refrigerant Tracking Manager. As mentioned, there are two reference books that affect your usage of the refrigerant tracking tools in SuccessWare 21. The reference books can be found in the Reference Library under Setup in the main menu, and those that are specific to refrigerant tracking are found under the Equipment volume. The first is Refrigerant Type. This table will come pre-built, containing a list of the most commonly used and recovered types of equipment with the standard color of the cylinder that refrigerant is generally distributed in. If you need to make additions to this list, you can feel free to do so. The other reference book is the Standard Equipment or Equipment Type list. Here, each of the different types of equipment that you add to your customer accounts is listed. If you bring this table into edit mode, there's a column called Uses Refrigerant. Any of the types of equipment that you have listed that would contain refrigerant, you're going to want to mark as Uses Refrigerant. You'll do so by highlighting the line, pressing Enter, and placing an X in the Uses Refrigerant column. Then press Enter to save. In order to process usage or recovery transactions against a piece of equipment on a customer's account, you must update the piece of equipment to include refrigerant information. To do so, open the customer and open their equipment records, and you can do this by double-clicking on Installations or clicking F6 on the keyboard. Highlight the piece of equipment that has refrigerant associated with its equipment type. In this case, I have an AC unit. And at the bottom of the screen, we have a tab for warranties and now one for refrigerant tracking. To add refrigerant information, place a check mark in front of the Track Refrigerant checkbox. And this is going to open up a window to allow us to record the appropriate information. In this case, I am actually going to be replacing this AC unit with a new one. So I'm going to be identifying this information for the existing unit so that we can process our recovery transaction, and I'm going to add a new piece of equipment for which we'll do our usage transaction. First, for the existing equipment, it contains R22, so we're going to indicate that. The listed capacity is 7 pounds, but this particular unit has 9.5 pounds of refrigerant in its system. There's a field here for leak rate. This is really intended for larger pieces of equipment over 50 pounds for which you're required by the EPA to track leak rate. Leak rate calculations are based upon one of two calculations, either rolling average or annualization. We've chosen rolling average by default. You can change this if necessary, but again, for a smaller piece of equipment, it's not really necessary. That's it for making the addition. I'm going to click OK, and it updates the information accordingly. I would now be able to record my recovery transaction, which will display down below once completed. So to save you from watching me do a bunch of data entry, I've already added the new piece of equipment to the customer's account. Condensing unit, Lennox brand, model number, serial number, the installation date, and so forth. I'm going to save that. And in doing so, I'm now able to access the Refrigerant Tracking tab to record the initial refrigerant information for this unit. So again, I'm going to check mark that we track refrigerant. This is a 410A system. So we're going to put that in there. And again, it's got a listed capacity that's different than its initial total charge. So it's listed as an 8.5 pound, but our actual total charge is 11 and 6 ounces. Bigger coil and line sets. And I don't have to modify any of the other information. Now, in a little bit later in the video, we're going to go ahead and actually process both transactions against this piece of equipment. We're going to recover the old refrigerant, the R22 from the old system, and we're going to process our usage transaction for the R410A. But the unit is now updated accordingly. So again, just keeping in mind, before you can process a usage or recovery transaction, you need to update the piece of equipment to identify the type of refrigerant and the charge for that system so we can process against it. Now, another important step that we have to complete before we can record any kind of usage or recovery transactions is actually to identify the cylinders that we're going to be using to recover and use refrigerant. This is done through the Refrigerant Tracking Manager. You're going to find that in the main menu under Customer Service and Refrigerant Manager. And I've already built a couple of cylinders already. What we're going to identify here is a number for the cylinder, its purpose, is it usage or recovery, the type of refrigerant that it contains, the tare weight for the cylinder. So what is the empty weight of that cylinder? And then what is its full weight? That's how the system is going to calculate, based upon its current weight, how much refrigerant is in that tank. We also have columns here, we'll look at these a little bit later, that show what our current capacity in those units is. Now, to create a new cylinder, we're going to right-click, create a new cylinder, and the cylinder number, it might be a serial number that's on the unit or something of that sort. For the sake of my example, I'm actually creating those numbers. I'm going to create a recovery cylinder for R410A. Once I've created a cylinder number, I'm going to identify the type of refrigerant. So this is my 410A. The purpose of the cylinder, in this case, is recovery. The tank has a tare weight of 5, so empty, it's 5, and full, it'll be 30 pounds. That's its maximum capacity. The new weight for the unit, let's just indicate here that this is an empty recovery tank. I haven't put anything in it yet. If you're building these cylinders initially and you've already got weight in them, weigh the tank, put in its new weight. The system will understand then how much of that weight is actually recovered refrigerant and how much room you have left in that tank. So in this case, I'm going to indicate that my new weight is just 5 pounds. It's an empty tank. And I'm going to enter an entry date here. So this is just the date that I'm putting this into the system, December 1st. I like to add a note in case I need to look at that at a later point. And I'm going to save. And this is added to our list. So I now have a couple of different recoveries for R22. I've got a recovery cylinder for R410A, a couple of usage tanks for doing recharges on R22 systems, and an R410A usage tank. Continue to add any tanks needed to match what you currently have available in your business. Now that we've updated our customer's equipment record and we have our cylinders in the system, we can process our transactions. So as I mentioned, I have a customer here that I'm doing a new installation for, removing an old unit. And the recording of transactions for usage and recovery of refrigerant can happen in a few different places. I can do it through the Refrigerant Tracking Manager, but from there I've actually got to know job numbers and different elements of that sort. So instead, I can go into the customer's record and go to their history. So I've got the job already out there, but it's not posted. So I've got a not invoiced indicator here. I'm going to double click, or I could hit F5, and it's going to bring up my service history. From here, I can open the job with a double click. And down at the bottom of the job form, you're going to see that we have a little refrigerant icon here. And giving that a click is going to allow me to record refrigerant usage and recovery. I'm going to close that up. Instead, I'm going to open up the invoice form. And I just want to show you from here. So I've got a very basic invoice for the installation of a Lennox AC unit. There is a drop down here that allows me to record usage and recovery. And we're going to do both here because remember, we took a system out of service and we're going to put a new one into service. So we're going to go to recovery. We're going to identify the cylinder number that we used. So I'm going to hit the drop down here, and we were recovering R22. And Brandy, my installation tech, had this cylinder with her. So we're going to select that. Now I've got a couple of different options of how I can handle the next step. We can either do the full recovery from the system and then reweigh the tank, and then choose the option of entering the new weight for the tank. And this will calculate how much was actually put into the tank. Or we can identify the actual amount that was recovered if we've tracked it that way. So I already had the tank on a scale, and I'm drawing it that way. Here I know the recovered amount was 9 pounds and 8 ounces. So we're going to enter that in there. We already have our job number here. We already have our technician identified. These are important values because for reporting purposes, we need to be able to show all transactions against a cylinder. We need to be able to show transactions against a service location. We need to show all transactions in a time period done by a particular technician. So it's important to have this data. There are multiple pieces of equipment on the account that had refrigerant in them. So we're going to pick from this drop down which unit it is that we're affecting. Now, in this case, it is this older AC unit, this Bryant unit. I'm going to put in today's date, or I'm sorry, the date of the actual installation as my transaction date. And we're going to click OK. So at this point, I could actually take that unit out of service if I wanted to do so. We've already emptied the whole thing. Let's take a look. I'm going to hit F6 on the keyboard. It's going to open up this piece of equipment here. And we can see that we actually have our process transaction that shows that there was a negative change here. We took 9 pounds, 8 ounces out of that particular tank. And we're done with this. This system is empty at this point. We're taking it out of service. I'm going to mark it as out of service. So I'm going to hit Edit, mark it as out of service, and save. And I'm not going to be able to process new transactions against that tank, against that piece of equipment, but I will have its history. Now we're going to go and process our usage transaction on the new system that we just put in. So I'm going to go to refrigerant usage. And again, which cylinder was she using? I only have one 410A cylinder, so that's the one that's being used. And again, I could just weigh the tank. So I've gone ahead and drawn 11 pounds, 6 ounces out of it. I could just put in that we used 11 pounds, 6 ounces. Or if I'm weighing the tank before and after, I can identify the new weight of the tank. I'm going to put in my used amount. So we used 11 pounds, 6 ounces. Again, now there's only one piece of equipment left on the account that has refrigerant, so it's been automatically selected for us. And we're going to put in our date of transaction and click OK. That's all that there is to it. So we're going to take a look in a little bit at the reporting side of things and see how that information is made available to us. Again, as another quick little look, if we take a look at that condensing unit now, we can see its refrigerant tracking history showing that it was charged with 11 pounds, 6 ounces of our 410A on 12/4/18. In addition to your standard usage and recovery transactions, there's a couple of other types of transactions that we can process against a cylinder. And I'm going to do these from my Refrigerant Tracking Manager. And again, I can go to the main menu and go to customer service for that. I've put a button up here on my toolbar. Now, there may be times, and we don't encourage this, but there may be times when transactions happen that you don't have a strict record for. So in this case, perhaps before we started tracking refrigerant in the system, we had some recovery that we did and it's been placed in this tank and I don't have the details to go with it. We can make what's called a correction or an adjustment to a cylinder's weight. So to do so, I'm going to come into my Refrigerant Tracking Manager, go to Cylinders, and we got filters here, so I can look for just usage, just recovery cylinders. And I can look for just particular types of refrigerant if I wish. So I'm looking for Refrigerant Recovery R22, and I got 2 tanks. And in this case, I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to enter a usage or recovery transaction. But this is where I'm actually going to do my cylinder correction as well. So to make a cylinder correction, I'm going to indicate it's a correction. I am actually going to enter a new weight for the tank. So it turns out we've got an extra couple of pounds of refrigerant in this tank. And I'll enter today's date as the transaction date. If I knew when the transaction happened, maybe I just don't have a job number or something like that, I would use that particular date. Let's say this was unknown recovery. And I'm going to save that. And as I return to my grid, you can see that the update has occurred. So my tank, which was 79.5% full, is now 87.5% full. Now this brings us to our next type of transaction, and that's taking a cylinder out of service. Generally, you do not want to put more than 80% of the capacity of refrigerant into a cylinder. This one we've gone over. We need to return it to our recycler or the recovery company that we work with. So to do so, we're going to right-click on the tank, and we're going to take it out of service. We're going to identify that it's out of service. Now, for something like a usage tank, where it's just empty, I might just mark it as out of service, and that's it. But here, we're actually returning the tank. We're returning it today, and my recovery vendor is Ferguson Supply, so we're going to identify that as well. That tank is no longer available, so I have separate now filtering up top that lets me look at those that have been returned, those that are out of service, and those that are still available. For larger pieces of equipment, the EPA has established guidelines for the tracking of leak rate for the unit. You can view the leak rate information for larger pieces of equipment through the Refrigerant Tracking Manager, as well as through the individual equipment form for that piece of equipment. Generally, we're looking at units that are over 50 pounds in refrigerant capacity. And we've got a view set up here in the Refrigerant Tracking Manager that lets you look for those. So the leak rate view gives you an ability to establish the capacity you're looking for, so I could take this to any number I wish, and establish the leak rate that I'm looking for on those pieces of equipment. So leak rate is how much that system is leaking over a 1-year period based on the number of usage entries that you've made on that equipment. When I ran this report, I had 2 items that showed up. One of them is currently in process of being followed up upon. It's actually got a 0 average right here, and I'll show you why in a moment, and another with a 19% leak rate. I'm going to double click on this piece of equipment at the top here. When I do, you can see that there were a couple of transactions here. And on the 15th, we discovered that we went over the leak rate allowed percentage. We did a repair. We did a successful follow-up verification test and entered that date. What that does with the leak rate information is it resets it at that point. So basically, since that repair was done and the verification was performed, there's been no additional refrigerant added to the system, so our rolling average leak rate right now is 0. I'm going to cancel that. Open up the other piece of equipment. In this case, we were just out there on the 13th, and our leak rate in this case is 19.5. Now, the allowable leak rate is 20%. I'm going to take care of this regardless. First and foremost, we did this addition of refrigerant on the 13th. We did a repair. We're going to put in the verification test result date. So on 12/13, we did that repair. Click OK. We verified. Our average goes back down to 0 at this point. But the EPA also requires follow-up testing to make sure that the unit is now properly repaired. And the number of follow-ups and how often they have to happen is completely dependent upon the type of equipment and the size or the capacity of refrigerant. And you can look that up. But in those situations where you have to do a follow-up, you can go to that piece of equipment. And again, I find it easier to do it here from the leak rate view. I'm going to double click. We're going to go to follow-ups and click add. We're going to be doing a leak inspection follow-up, and we're going to do this one in February. I'm going to add a little note. Now, please keep in mind, you're actually going to have to create this job at a point. This is just a reminder that we're going to have available to us. And I'm going to click OK. Click OK again. And if we go to our follow-up view, we can set a date range so we can look at all follow-ups that need to happen from today's date, or I can put in any date range, and it's going to bring up this list for me. And here's the one that we've got now set for February, and there was one that was actually due today. So let's go take a look at resolving this. I'm going to close the view. I actually have the job here on my dispatch board. Now I've already got a job up here on the dispatch board that we've already run. So let me open up the invoice really quick. So we did our follow-up inspection. There's a couple of different approaches you can take to getting to the follow-up form. First, if you associate the piece of equipment with the repair, so I've highlighted my line item, click the Equip button, and I'm check marking the unit that I actually did the inspection on in this case. The refrigerant dropdown will now contain an option to go to refrigerant follow-up. This will let me go in here and actually record my transaction. Let's save that. And instead, I'm going to open the job to show you a different way that I can do it. In the job form itself, there's a little refrigerator button here that we can give a click to and go to refrigerant follow-up as well. We'll go to the follow-ups tab. Here's the leak inspection that we were doing as part of this job. I'm going to double click. We're going to indicate that it's been completed. And the job number, we're going to hit the drop down, and here's the job that we were just out on right here. So we're going to select that. And we'll add in our notes, successful test. Now, if we needed to add another leak inspection, so again, certain units you have to go quarterly, some once a year, we could go and create a new one at this point and add it to that account. Leak rate reporting is available to you from directly inside of the Refrigerant Tracking Manager, as well as through the report gallery. In the report gallery, you'll find the reports under Equipment in the Groups area. And there's two reports, one that allows you to pull up all equipment that has a leak rate over a percentage that you assign based on capacity. And this is the same thing that we can do with the leak rate view in the manager itself. The other report is Refrigerant Transactions. And again, I can access this from the report gallery, or we can actually right-click in the background of the Refrigerant Tracking Manager and open the cylinder transaction report. We'll take a look at that in just a second. The other thing that I can do from within the Refrigerant Tracking Manager itself is, in a really quick way, I can select any one of my cylinders, I can right-click on it, and I can view the transactions for that cylinder. And when I do so, it's going to take me to the second tab of the Tracking Manager where I see a listing of all of the individual transactions. And if I want to print this, I can by right-clicking and generating a grid report. The cylinder tracking report does a little bit more, though. There's a lot of different responsibilities that you have in relation to refrigerant tracking reporting. In many cases, you're going to have to report on all activity for a cylinder itself. There are requirements for certified technicians that you be able to report on a monthly basis of all of their transactions, and all of that can be done from here. So I'm going to leave the date range open, but I can go and look at all transactions on a specific cylinder. I can group by maybe the location where the transactions happened, or by the technician, or by the transaction date. I'm going to double click on transaction date and run the report, and we get a breakdown by date of all the transactions against this cylinder itself, including the fact that on 12/13 it was taken out of service. If I'm looking to run this report by technician, then what I can do instead is do my cylinder transaction report. I'm just going to pick a specific technician, Brandy. I'm going to look over the course of the last month. I'm going to group by purpose. So we're going to look at all of the refrigerant transactions by usage, by recovery for Brandy. Give that a click. And we can see here over the course of the last month, Brandy had one recovery transaction. It shows the cylinder, the amount, one usage transaction, and again, we see that detail. So again, this report can be run in a whole bunch of different ways by just simply using a different grouping option to subtotal the data as you need to see it. Remember, with this or any other feature of SuccessWare 21, if you have questions, would like a little more assistance, give a call to our support line at 888-251-2779.